Alright everyone, it's time for a general video refuting a couple of points that are being made with regards to the concept of internet censorship. But what you see right now is a freak show whereby people who themselves aren't really big believers in liberty, they don't really have a problem with censorship, I suppose, it's really funny, are attempting to use libertarian principles to prop up their arguments. I guess the idea that they would come out and say what they really feel, which is, hey, I don't have a problem with people being abused ideologically. It wouldn't work as an argument, so they have to default to pretending to be ANCAPs or something. Now, first, let me tell you, 90% of the people making these arguments are not libertarians of any type. They're not limited government lovers, they're not on the monarchist side, and they're certainly not ANCAPs. They are authoritarians, essentially. They're boring centrists who don't get censored because they have boring views, or they're authoritarian, in a higher degree, actually, and they like the concept of maybe ideological abuse a little bit too. And some of them are libertarians in name only that do not appear to understand the underlying ideological fabric of what they, I guess, consider to be nothing more than a partisan sort of thing. Here are the two basic refutations here that I would say. First and foremost, if you're saying, well, actually three, technically. The first is just ideological. You got to ask yourself, a group of people who have conglomerated a country in the sense of the founding of the U.S., who install things like the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the importance of it goes beyond the legal into the ideological. There's a reason for the framing of a constitution in that sense in the first place. I think you would be hard-pressed to find anyone at the time who would have said, oh, it's perfectly fine, though, if private ventures, which have become monopolistic in some way, take up the same variants of abuse that we're trying to restrain government from actually undertaking. The government can't tell you can't say X, Y, and Z. But the private printing firm can tell you, no, you can't print this literature, blackball you from ever using a printing press. The problem is that for the average person, they would not have had their own access to such a thing. Or saying that buildings like, let's say a renter didn't want you operating the press there. Well, you can't own paper and pens in my building because you have the wrong opinions. It would have been considered, I think, a little bit strange. You'd have to twist yourself in knots to actually go forth and make these arguments. The second is the breaching of capitalism, really, within the structure of the internet as we know it today. The big social media firms, especially Facebook, YouTube, and so forth, are monopolies. They are monopolies. Within the realm of human communication, there are essentially only a half a dozen websites and a few domain registrars hosting most of these sites that actually matter in the long term. If you get de-indexed by Google, your site essentially does not exist, for example. If you have released literature and Amazon doesn't want to touch it, Barnes & Noble doesn't want to touch it, it basically doesn't exist for the mass market. It's a strangulation, a bottlenecking of human communication. I would say this. For a few tech firms to get together in their monopolistic fashion and say, well, certain opinions which are lawful, they're not even particularly harmful, it's just we don't happen to like them. We're going to suppress them from airing these grievances on our sites. That is essentially akin to, a few hundred years ago, you saying, well, this person has been boycotted by the paper companies. They are now unable to buy a ream of paper to write with. Or they can't buy a fountain pen. The Bic company has decided they can't have pens and made sure that everyone else thinks the same. The problem, additional to this, is essentially that they're being goaded to make these decisions by corporate overlords that directly partner with governments. And here's the next point. Governments and non-governmental organizations, the lobbying firms basically, when you think about it, along with groups within the media who are already moneyed and they're in bed with politicians, these people all schmooze together, they talk together, they're part of the same apparatus. They are the ones goading the big tech firms into doing this. Now, let me ask this. What's the difference between, for instance, the U.S. government attempting to say to its citizens, you can't criticize the government, and the U.S. government leaning on big tech firms to crack down on people who are going against the government? What's the difference? Fundamentally, there is no difference in the modern day and age. The problem is this. Because of the rise of the internet and especially social media, most human communication now, the vast majority of it, anywhere in the Western world, no longer takes place between two human beings in a direct sense. It no longer takes place in the sense of putting up billets on a wooden post somewhere in the middle of town. It no longer takes the form of holding a town meeting. That still happens. You can still communicate that way, but it is vastly, vastly outmaneuvered. It's far more efficient to do it online. Online, you can reach the same number of people. It takes you 10 seconds maybe. You set up a page on one of these sites. The problem is that unless we're comfortable with the concept that we're going to have to abolish this kind of mass communication entirely and sort of go back in technological progress, or have an intranet like China and say, well, we're just going to shield everything, censor everything, we're just going to let the government do it at this point, I think that's a negative direction to go into. I would further lodge a pragmatic complaint. Now, this matters too. It goes beyond ideology. I've warned libertarians, don't be too idealistic about libertarianism. It's all well and good to say everyone magically gets along in ANCAP land, but you have to be pragmatic about the possibility of, number one, instituting, and number two, maintaining such a system. This is why I'm not an open borders libertarian. If we go down the dark road of allowing big tech firms that are co-opted and coerced by, in some cases, foreign states as well, into censoring opinions that they happen to find harmful, it will destroy the capitalistic machinery of the web. It will cause censorship towards other organizations, other businesses. Again, Google de-indexes your site. It basically ceases to exist. That's the truth. So another private firm, if you're making the argument, well, private firms can do what they want, okay, well then a private firm, Google is the main indexer. At the very least, they should have to index fairly. They shouldn't simply be able to kick somebody off at a whim. It would literally destroy the fabric of the internet. Another internet might have to be constructed, which is also possible. Another thing that people say, well, if you don't like this censorship, just create your own YouTube. Again, you've got a monopolistic bottom, like YouTube hosts the debates at this point. More people are watching the debates on YouTube than they are on TV. How is a person, that's not fair competition, it's not a free market. Government entities and their buddies that they trade money and power with and favors with coerce and work with the big tech firms. That is not a free market. That's a carpetbag style situation. Now you can go two ways. You can either say, well, then it's going to be a public utility and or constrained by the Constitution. Go back to the pre-big censorship style of social media. No more problem. You can do what you want. And also competitor sites can still compete. There would still be fair competition. Here's why. If Google, YouTube especially, Amazon, all these sites were not able to censor unless it was criminal or maybe pornographic in nature, for various reasons. If they were not censoring that material, it would be an even playing field for free speech upstarts. It would actually be a little more beneficial towards the big tech firms. But money-wise, if somebody comes along, if BitChute comes along, lowers its bottom line by 10 times, its actual cost of functioning by saying, hey, we've decentralized it, we're using like crypto, blockchain, all this stuff, they'll outcompete YouTube in due time, but not if Google, its parent company, is able to de-index the site. That's not a free competition. That's not a free market. That's a strangulated, government co-opted market. No, the privatization of abuse in a situation where government entities and their buddies and lobbies and all of their moneyed corporate shill cronies are able to throw money or threats at a tech firm and cause them to alter their behavior, that violates their rights too. It actually violates the rights of the big tech firms for them to do that. Because these groups are literally attempting to, they're saying, do as we say, or we will exercise government power over you. This nation of Germany will block your site. The nation of the UK will fine you. Some foreign court that has nothing to do with the US firm. Let me ask further, in the American sense, if libertarians are comfy with the concept that a foreign state would be threatening to sue our businesses when they could simply be termed public utilities once they've reached some arbitrary threshold market share within a certain part of human communication. Amazon is the publishing giant. YouTube's the video giant. Twitter and Facebook are sort of like social text giants, essentially. Facebook Messenger, of course, is now the only part of Facebook that still is popular. Everything else is like gone down the toilet. Who uses Facebook standalone on their computer anymore? I have a Facebook page on there that I update. That's the same updates that I put on Minds. More people watch it on Minds by far. What the hell is the point of even having a Facebook for the most part, except to use Messenger for the phone obsessed? Just use something else too. You should boycott Facebook. It's a shitty company. It's losing money fast, and even Zuckerberg's scared. When Zuckerberg shows human emotion, being a Generation 2 synth as he is, you know that there's a problem. But yeah, that's just a little bit about how funny it is when people who don't fundamentally, it seems, understand the concept of limiting government and liberty in general. It's very funny when they attempt to use straw man arguments that I guess they assume ANCAPs make to try to prop up the concept of corporate censorship on a platform that is essentially a monopoly. It doesn't make any sense. Monopolization is an essence of corporatism. It has nothing to do with true capitalism. True capitalism is people competing on an even keel. The second government gets involved, it is no longer capitalistic. Simply instituting a constitutional amendment, by the way, to guarantee a fair playing field and non-censorship doesn't violate capitalism. It's a constitutional ethos. It's limiting government further as well. Just turn around and include the same extra limitations on government. Just render it a public utility. Open it up for people to be able to sue a company for mistreating them and censoring them for posting material that is not otherwise illegal or legitimately censored. Pornographic material. Of course, you had children on the platform. But if somebody's firing a gun on video, who cares? Someone says something offensive, it's not targeting any specific person or thing, it's not a credible threat. Who cares? Not criminal. Let him be a bigot. Let other people, if they find it offensive, turn the material off. This is what we should have done with radio. We should have done this with radio. We should have done this with cable. Then cable wouldn't be dying right now. CNN would be able to drop an F-bomb on live TV, and the pearl clutchers would hate it. But the pearl clutchers also hate it if people can be indecent or offensive anywhere else. I can't think of anything more liberty-loving than being, in some cases, deliberately offensive. It was pointed out at the big Liberty meeting the other day. You remember Liberty PAC or something, I think it was? That focusing on offensive speech sort of denies the point of free speech entirely. That's true. If you're simply fixated on speech you happen not to like, what about all the other speech that's going on, and why are you making that subjective decision, expecting others to live by it? No. I do not believe that privatizing abuse is libertarian or liberty-loving or acceptable within a constitutional framework such as ours. It breaches the very concept, the very truths that they held self-evident when they penned the Constitution in the first place. It's not the point. It's not legally written there. The concept of a monopolistic mega-corporation owning all human communication was something they never could have possibly thought of. Do you think then, therefore, they would have looked at a situation like this and said, okay, yeah, that's fine, it's a private business. They talk to the government all the time, they have exclusive interviews with government figures, they're listening to foreign states, but it's okay for them to abuse people, or do you think they'd be uncomfortable with that? I'm going to hazard probably the latter, in the classically liberal or constitutionalist sense, maybe more than the modern LP. Of course, the modern Libertarian Party is becoming closer and closer to being just a weed party. That's about all. Peace out.